On this episode of News World, many of us watch him on Fox News, so I'm thrilled he would take time out of his amazingly busy day and talk with me about his new book, To Rescue the American Spirit, Teddy Roosevelt and the Birth of a Superpower. I'm, of course, talking about Bret Baier. He's the author of 6 New York Times bestsellers, including 2 others in this current series, To Rescue the Republic and To Rescue the Constitution. I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, who has been amazingly busy covering everything that's going on, Bret Baier. He is the chief political anchor for Fox News Channel and the anchor and executive editor of A Special Report with Bret Baier. He's also host of Fox News Audio, the Bret Baier Podcast. Bret, welcome and thank you for joining me again on Newt's World.
Mr. Speaker, it's always great to be back with you. Thank you.
Before we dive into the book, obviously with everything going on, I just have to ask you, with all of your vast experience, what's your reflection on the last couple of days?
I just think it's a major moment. We'll see how it pans out in the long term, but call it historic seems like we're sliding it a bit. The fact that President Trump and his administration could get all sides to get to this point, to get those images of 20 living hostages and the reuniting with the families, I think it changed the world for that short part. I do believe that it could be a paradigm shift in the region. There seems to be, just by talking to people in the region that I've talked to for many years, buy-in. There's buy-in to try to get to a solution. So I think just reporting it on its facts is historic and big, but I think we have a lot yet to report about what it's going to look like in the Middle East. Could change the face of the Middle East.
I thought it was astonishing, and I don't remember any president who quite achieved all that in one day, so it's pretty remarkable. But he's now home, and he's home to a government shutdown. You're a real pro about these things. What's your sense of what happens there?
There is this standoff, and it is almost reversed about what we've seen before. Democrats previously have been very pro continuing resolution and clean CRs and funding the government to battle another day on the specifics of appropriation. Now it's exactly the opposite. As far as the political fallout, I'm not sure, who's going to feel it most. Right now, I think Democrats may, but I think that now as the checks are going to stop coming out to folks, that there's going to be increasing pressure, and we'll see which side blinks.
You, of course, cover the daily news to a remarkable degree, but you also have this passion for presidential biographies, and every time I've interviewed you, I've been fascinated because you pick up things that nobody else has picked up. Tell us why you chose Theodore Roosevelt.
Each one of the presidents that I've written about, I looked, Mr. Speaker, at a soda straw moment that maybe was overlooked in history, that perhaps changed our perspective of how we as a country operated or how we look at that particular president. For Teddy Roosevelt, the entire focus, the thing that makes him so consequential, is that he chose to make America broader in the world, decided that we needed to be forward-leaning in the way that we dealt with the world. He was also a larger-than-life figure who, is just chock full of stories and anecdotes, which makes for great page-turning in writing, and he was prolific in writing himself. But I think that his ability to sense that the U.S. needed to be forward-leaning was kind of what brought me to him. At the turn of the century, a president that was looking to the new world and saying America needed to lead in the world.
He's fascinating because he's packed so much stuff into his life, and he believed in such an active, energetic approach. In some ways, there's a parallel, I think, with Trump, just in the sheer explosion of human energy.
I agree. And I make those comparisons in the intro and kind of my summary in the book. There are some similarities with President Trump, that larger-than-life figure, the person who loved interacting with the press and was controversial at times, but also captivated the American people to the point where there was this sort of joy about it all. He was not conforming, and he did not like to go with the status quo. You saw that all throughout his life as a police commissioner, as a legislator in the New York State legislature, as New York governor, as vice president, and then obviously he's president as the result of assassination of President McKinley.
I couldn't help but think of the parallel in terms of peacemaking with Teddy's role in bringing Japan and Russia to Portsmouth and getting them to negotiate an end to the Russo-Japanese War. Different style in a way, but very similar effort to get to peace and to get foreign countries to pay attention.
It was largely overlooked. He brokers this agreement in the Russo-Japanese War, and it seemed maybe obscure at the moment in the big picture. But that is actually the moment that I think it's America's entry into a larger global role. And the world sees the U.S. as the person and the country that could bring that together. You know, in the wake of that, he then does something that Ronald Reagan would echo, peace through strength. He wants to show how powerful the U.S. is, proceeds to paint all of the battleships from gray to white, and it calls it the Great White Battleships, and sends them out around the world in a tour to show the magnificent Navy that the U.S. has. And it had an effect, and the world paid attention. And suddenly we were bigger.
Am I correct that he didn't actually have the money to go all the way around, and he said, I'm going to send the ships out, and then Congress is either going to provide the money or they're going to sit out there?
That's exactly right. And when he started out, they didn't know how far they were going to go because they were unfunded. But after its magnificent launch and the sun opens up, it's just a beautiful thing. It's perceived in the world's eyes. It's a big deal, and Congress laments and moves forward.
In terms of presidential leadership with a reluctant Congress, that's one of the great stories in American history.
Yeah, that's true. He rolled the dice and they came around.
You open up things I had never thought about. And I really like the degree to which you see Roosevelt not just as president, but as this extraordinary cultural figure capturing a version of America at a moment when we were really trying to think through and identify ourselves. Can you talk a little bit about his 1899 strenuous life speech, because it sort of captures the essence of Roosevelt?
Yeah, it really does. It's his entree into how he feels about life. He thinks that you should take life and really be dedicated to it. He later obviously does what later became the Man in the Arena speech after leaving the presidency. But that same theme of the American heart, declaring it good, the country's bristling with opportunity, and he wants to take it by the horns. Each one of these presidents I wrote about has some effort to go through, some cross to bear in their growing up, some crucible. Teddy Roosevelt was horrific asthma, and they didn't think he was going to amount to much. In fact, his parents tried everything to break the asthma. They even had him smoking cigars and drinking strong coffee, which was supposed to get rid of it. It didn't. It made him sick, but they made him go outside and breathe the fresh air, and that's what led him to the Great Plains later in North Dakota. He is this free spirit who engages a bristling, bustling, expanding America, and he's almost a caricature of what America would become.
In terms of his scale, I think, if I remember correctly, he wrote a book about the birds of New York when he was still in his teens. He writes a 2-volume history of the Naval War of 1812, which is still considered a first-rate piece of work. And he did that, I think, in his early 20s. I mean, this is a guy, I think he wrote 40-some books altogether. It's amazing.
He was really prolific, especially when it came to that. For most of his life, he believed he was going to be a scientist. That outdoor part to solve the asthma got him interested in specimens and birds and all kinds of things. And his father said it was a good idea. He collected specimens and almost had a museum in their house, to the point where they traveled overseas. His brother Elliot would room with him, and Elliot came to their father and said, "Dad, I need my own room." And the father said, "You can't have your own room. Why do you need your own room?" And he walked him back to the room, and there was Teddy Roosevelt on this European trip had collected all these dead birds and entrails in the bathtub and all this stuff that had become a museum in the hotel. And the father said, "Elliot, you can have your own room." So he always wanted to be a scientist, but that was something that he always thought he wanted to continue. And that stream of conservationism, really, as president, he makes big strides and changes the way America looks today based on what happened back then.
Why do you think he organized the Rough Riders to go to Cuba?
First of all, he was very into helping Cuba fight off Spain. He believed that we were not answering the call and their need. And having been out west and having interacted with these characters out there, he fell in love with them. But he also had his Northeastern college guys, the college dandies, who wanted to join up with him. So he put them together in this cornucopia of fighters that became the Rough Riders. And the stories of that are really just chock full of these anecdotes of these two sides of the Wild West and the Northeast college guys fighting in San Juan. What he was always about was leadership. It wasn't charge. It was follow me up the hill. He came back from that literally a hero and somebody that the world paid attention to. Now, I will say, to be all fair, he had a number of press reporters that traveled with him. So the stories coming out were very focused on that group. So it was pretty good. Early days of a podcast or something with the reporters with you.
Well, there's a great story in one of the biographies of Roosevelt. When they get down to Tampa, try to get to Cuba, the whole thing's chaos. It's badly organized. Roosevelt commandeers the ship and notices the two leading war correspondents trying to get to Cuba and says, "Oh, why do you come ride with me?"
Now, does that sound like Trump or what?
Yeah. And the biographer closed by saying, and so the greatest self-propagandist of the 19th century merrily sailed off to war with two war correspondents in tow. Trump would have admired that. And I have a hunch that Trump probably, to some extent, sees in Roosevelt a forerunner of what he would do.
Definitely. I joke about having all those reporters. There clearly was heroism and there were big acts, and obviously some of those Rough Riders didn't make it back. But the stories of that live on forever, and he was savvy enough to see that as he was commandeering that ship to go over to Cuba. You know, he also didn't fit a mold. Sometimes you didn't know what Teddy Roosevelt was going to do. So that's the battle between, Republican and conservatism and progressivism. He had this thought that you have to be the leader, but you also have to take care of the lowest among us. And he brought that to the presidency.
One of the things you bring up, I'd never seen the story of how Roosevelt operated after McKinley was shot in Buffalo. And he'd gone up there, he'd been faithfully by his side, and then thought he was recovering. So he went off hiking. I mean, all the stuff I've read about Roosevelt, I have never read this section.
Yeah. So he gets the word that McKinley's been shot at the Buffalo Exposition, makes his way there, but is told, and his friends say, he's never really thinks, oh, this is the end. He doesn't think that this is how he's going to become president. And almost it's in his mind that that's not going to happen. The doctors say that he is recovering, McKinley, and to the point where they say, go ahead, continue your family vacation. He goes on to the Adirondacks and he is way out of civilization when a shot rings out as he's hiking on the top of Mount Mercy, the tallest of those peaks. And it is a local guy who has been sent to get him with a telegram saying the situation has gotten well worse. By the time he makes it down and gets in the carriage with a treacherous ride to the train station, they reach him again to say McKinley had died. So by the time he gets to Buffalo, he pays his respects. He says to the cabinet he's not going to change. He's going to continue on with the McKinley policies, which lasted for some time, but not that long because he is an individual man.
I mean, here's, I think, the beginning of the real progressive movement. And it's, I think, part of his energy level. But also, I have to take one divergence in terms of the point you make, which is exactly right, that in many ways, Teddy Roosevelt is a bigger impact as a cultural figure. Somebody once said he was probably the most popular president since Washington. Share briefly the whole story of Teddy's Bear.
I tell you, the entire life story of Teddy Roosevelt has this kind of larger life figure. And he sets up Sagamore Hill in New York as his home base. It's his escape. And he is a hunter. He has it lined with bison and polar bears. And I talked to Tweed Roosevelt, his great-grandson, and he said, there was nothing like being in this house. There were so many things for kids to play with. You know, when the kids, there were 6 all, 5 with Edith, 1 from Alice. When they lived in the White House, it was nonstop fun. There were times during the Oval Office where he'd be meeting with dignitaries, and at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the kids would come in and say, "Pa, it's time." And he would wish goodbye to whoever he was with, and he would go play with the kids. And there were animals that ended up in the White House. There were horses that were on the second floor. There were bicycles that were going down the hallway. And he had this larger-than-life laughter that you would hear through the halls of the White House. And, you know, some of those figures obviously came back in these stories.
It's funny because when I go occasionally to the East Room, I find myself thinking about that the kids rode horses.
Yeah.
On a rainy day, they're inside the White House.
Inside the White House.
It's just sort of classically Theodore Roosevelt. The part of the tragedy of his life was that he splits the Republican Party in 1912, although fascinatingly, it's the beginning of having primaries. He wins the primaries. It's just that the old machine states stick with Taft. And Roosevelt, I think, was enormously frustrated by what was going on in Europe and his sense that Wilson just didn't get it.
Yeah. And his fight against pacifism and his battles with Woodrow Wilson would continue after that. But a lot of people point to the fact that the Bull Moose Party and its surge when he runs gives Wilson the win at that time, at that crucial time. So historians will look back and say conservatives bristled at Teddy Roosevelt in that time. You know, he did provide a challenge in those primaries. The machine, which Teddy Roosevelt fought against every step of the way as legislature, police commissioner, as governor, as vice president, as assistant secretary of the Navy, all of the machine circled around, and it changed the dynamic as obviously Woodrow Wilson would eventually lead to World War I.
In Roosevelt's case, something that I think forgotten in history, but he actively supported African Americans. The first president to actually have dinner in the White House with an African American leader. And he really did represent an effort to bridge beyond slavery and segregation in a way which tragically Woodrow Wilson totally reversed. As a guy born in Virginia, Wilson was totally for segregation. But it does strike me that part of Roosevelt's progressivism was this sense of inclusion that really had a big impact.
I agree with you 100%. Brian Kilmeade kind of went down that road with his book. And I think that where Teddy Roosevelt was about increasing the tent and not shrinking it. And some of those policies crossed over. And I think he didn't see skin color at that time. What really was interesting is that he's president at 42 years old. He dies at age 60. His son, Quentin, dies in the war in a plane crash, and he really never physically recovers. He says he does, and he still gives speeches, but the broken heart eventually leads back to his death in January of 1919. Died in his sleep, and his vice president said he had to go in his sleep because Teddy Roosevelt would have fought it off in the daytime.
He'd also, I think, been weakened when he went to the Amazon. And on that trip, apparently caught a whole bunch of tropical diseases.
He survived it, but that trip down the Amazon was really death-defying, and at the time, people thought crazy. But he came back with all kinds of anecdotes, another book about the Amazonian flora and fauna, and barely survived, but he did survive.
I suspect part of the difference was he had done Africa earlier, but the part of Africa he was in was dramatically less disease-ridden. Had he gone up the Congo, he'd have understood the Amazon basin. I think he underestimated how really difficult that was going to be. And I think at one point they thought he was going to die on the Amazon trip.
100% did. And there are amazing stories how he survives. Has to go by himself in a canoe to get downriver as he's fighting malaria and other diseases.
It's a little hard to imagine anybody having quite the frontiersman outlook. As you pointed out earlier, this is a guy who has asthma and is weak when he's like a teenager and just decides by sheer willpower that he's going to strengthen himself until he's able to be a frontiersman, a rancher, a hunter. I mean, extraordinary character.
He was larger than life. He's only 5'10", but he was larger than life. That time out west really pardoned him. He got a lot of grief for wearing glasses. They called him Four Eyes, but he was a boxer. And when somebody came at him, he took him down. There's a story of being in a bar and some guy with two guns comes up and says, Four Eyes, you're going to pay the bar tab. And Teddy Roosevelt laughs and the guy says, no, I'm serious. And Roosevelt hauls off and hits him and then hits him again. The guy falls and hits his head on the bar, passes out, and the whole bar erupts saying, we hate that guy. They took him out to the shed. And that was the beginning of his time in North Dakota.
Those are the kind of things that become legends.
Yeah, exactly.
When he campaigns for governor in 1898 after Cuba, they actually have a bugler on the train who blows the cavalry charge as they leave each station.
And he brought Rough Riders. Each stop, he pointed out a couple of the guys that were with him on that journey in San Juan.
To your point earlier, but he was such a reformer that the machine in New York was desperate to get rid of him. And that's how he ends up on the ticket with McKinley. And McKinley's great political advisor, Mark Hanna, who's a great businessman, for some reason wasn't around. And when he gets back, he learns that they've named Roosevelt vice president. And the story is, he said, you realize there's only one heartbeat between that damn cowboy and the White House?
But they thought they could take this reformer and put him in a spot. This is the days before the Dick Cheney vice presidency, where the vice president was just kind of a figurehead, nothing much more, and put him in that slot and control him because they believed that he was such a reformer and troublemaker that he could be a problem for the party.
And he probably would have been, I think. Given your schedule and all the things you're doing, you also have a pretty serious upcoming book tour. I want to invite people to come and hear you and have a chance to meet you because, again, you're a national figure because of your show. And you're going to be, correct me if I get this wrong, but October 25th, you're going to be at the Vero Beach Book Center.
I am. Big store.
And then on the 26th, you're going to be at the Barnes & Noble in the Villages. Is that right?
It is.
You're crisscrossing the country.
I am. Then I go to California.
And so you're going back on the 27th to the Nixon Presidential Library. And the following night, you'll be in Simi Valley at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation.
You know, I've done this tour.
That's quite a tour.
It is. I've done this kind of path in each one of these books, and it's been very successful. There've been 3 number ones, so I figured why change? There's just a lot of history buffs that go to all of those spots that show up in big numbers. And I love to talk about the book and take questions, and they all do it well.
If you're a serious book writer, you realize you have to spend as much time selling the book as you spent writing it.
100%.
That's what a lot of authors don't quite get. They're so exhausted when they're done writing, they just kind of go, oh my God, I can't do this.
That starts the journey. That's right.
You're also a great golfer.
I played in college.
And you managed to keep it up, right? You and the little white ball have had a long relationship. I just have to add, because golf takes time. To stay as good as you are takes time. And you have a show every night, which is, I think, probably the high point of news delivery at Fox, and does a great job routinely. It makes it seem like it's just normal, although I suspect you work at it pretty hard. And then you write books, and then you go sell books. I mean, how do you organize your time?
The golf, I usually do one time a week. Either it balls or I play with my son or something transpires. I just try to keep it up. And see if it can hold on to that handicap. Right now, I'm a walking wallet. I'm essentially passing money to my friends. But the show, I have a great staff, and we do work on it, and it is different every day, and it's like drinking from a fire hose. So that takes time. The books have been just a labor of love, and I have a real great blueprint. I have a super researcher who just parks at presidential libraries and gets these nuggets that become the blueprint and the quilt of how we look at this book. And it usually takes about a year and a half. I ping pong back and forth with my co-author, and we come up with a plan. The first book, On 3 Days in January, about Dwight D. Eisenhower, took 3 years, 3.5 years. But then I kind of got this blueprint and this soda straw look at different moments of presidential life, and I figured it out down to a year and a half.
You're amazingly competent. I know you're going to continue to educate the country. I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, To Rescue the American Spirit, Teddy Roosevelt and the Birth of a Superpower, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And I want to remind our listeners they can watch Special Report with Bret Baier weeknights at 6 p.m. Eastern on the Fox News Channel. Thank you very much, Bret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you to my guest, Bret Baier. You can get a link to buy his new book, To Rescue the American Spirit, Teddy Roosevelt and the Birth of a Superpower, on our show page at newsworld.com. Newsworld is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Pendley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newsworld, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newsworld can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newsworld.